Hello and welcome to the Al Monitor Brief. It's Monday, June 17th. I'm Kristen Tallman. Today's main segment is a conversation with Adam Lucente, Al Monitor's news and business correspondent on the Middle East presence at the G7 summit, the BRICS summit, and this past weekend's Ukraine Peace Summit. But first, let's get you caught up on the headlines. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu dissolved the 6-member war cabinet on Monday after the walkout of ministers Benny Gantz and Eskenkot on June 9th. Saudi Arabia on Monday warned of a temperature spike in Mecca as Muslim pilgrims wrapped up the Hajj in searing conditions, with more than a dozen heat-related deaths confirmed. Qatar Airways is close to finalizing the purchase of a major stake in RwandAir, perhaps even as close as next month, according to the Central African Airlines chief executive. Israel struck Gaza on Monday, and witnesses reported blasts in the besieged territory's south, but fighting has largely subdued after a day of relative calm and as Muslims marked Eid. Iran and Sweden announced a prisoner exchange on Saturday in which a former Iranian official was released in Sweden in exchange for a European Union diplomat and a second Swede. Now, on to the main segment. Hey, Adam, welcome back to the Al Monitor Brief.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Adam, this past weekend, there was a heavy Middle East presence at the G7 summit. I was looking at photos and I even saw Turkey's Erdogan was sitting right next to Biden at a roundtable discussion. Can you walk us through who was there, what was discussed, and how the Middle East region and leaders played a role at this year's G7?
Yeah, so the G7, there were a few other countries invited who participated as well. UAE President MBZ, Jordan's King Abdullah, Turkish President Erdogan, as you mentioned. There were some meetings among those few. And on the first day of the summit, the G7 countries pledged billions of dollars in additional aid to Ukraine. Then on Friday, the statement came out, and that highlighted some of the key priorities for the core G7 members at this yearly meeting. So on Gaza, that was a big part of their discussions there, obviously, with the war going on. There wasn't much new from their statement. They condemned Hamas for using civilian infrastructure. They said at the same time, Israel must comply with international law. Notably, they said they, quote, fully endorse and will stand behind, end quote, President Biden's proposal for a ceasefire in Gaza. So there is some international backing for that. They also condemned what they said was Iran's destabilizing actions in the region and their nuclear escalations. And that led to a response from the Iranian Foreign Ministry, which basically just condemned the statements. And another big priority for Italy, and being the host of the G7, was migration, illegal, irregular migration from Africa in the Mediterranean into Europe. Italy's been very focused on that, and the statement said that they want to focus on the root causes of irregular migration. So not just, border security, working on the economy, and they said efforts by international criminal networks to get people to migrate. So, and that's interesting because Italy under Prime Minister Meloni, she's, had recent deals and visits with Tunisia and Libya. There's obviously the big gas relations with Algeria that she's working on. So they are kind of trying to boost the countries below them, their economy, in an effort to stem migration. The only other thing I'll highlight from G7, which was notable, was they addressed the situation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. The statement said that the G7 welcomes the appointment of a new Palestinian Authority cabinet recently. And they said that they condemn what they call the, quote, actions that weaken the Palestinian Authority. And they specifically mentioned Israel withholding revenues to the Palestinian Authority, which is something that happens sometimes and has happened since the war began because of the tensions between the two. So that was interesting language.
Interesting to see how much the G7 is expanding to really view also the Middle East as complex, right? They have different demands or wishes for Northern Africa, with wanting to stem migration and to Europe, and through that trying to economically bolster. But then also there's different diplomacy tactics with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for example, even though Saudi Arabia's MBS didn't attend because of the start of Hajj.
Right.
I want to zoom out even more. And last week, the BRICS summit took place in Russia, and there was also a heavy Middle East presence. Can you walk me through just kind of the comparison between those two and and how they're playing a big role at two summits?
Yeah, so the BRICS summit last week in Russia was foreign ministers meetings. So it was, the BRICS foreign ministers, and so not as opposed to the heads of state. And it's interesting because it's, the first meeting they had since Iran, Egypt, UAE, and Ethiopia joined the group earlier this year. So obviously there was, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, the UAE's Foreign Minister Abdullah bin Zayed. He went. There were some meetings, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Prince Faisal bin Farhan, Saudi Foreign Minister, was there. The Iranian acting Foreign Minister Bagheri Khani, he was there as well. One thing that was big there is, it's continuing to display Russia and China's inroads into the Middle East with the expansion of BRICS and the Middle Eastern countries being well represented at BRICS. And another big highlight from that is, they talked a lot about currency, and they've talked about this before, but they want to use their own currencies for trade and not the dollar. That was something they talked about a lot. And, it's not new, but it is, we are seeing some movement, particularly with Iran and Russia facing sanctions, to use, not the dollar, use their national currency for trade. And if that actually becomes adopted, either through the BRICS platform or some of these other mechanisms, that could have a lot of consequences for the U.S. And it's interesting. There's just been so many conferences lately, the BRICS last week and then the G7. And also over the weekend, there was a Ukraine summit in Switzerland. And it's notable there that, that summit, which was organized by Ukraine, Qatar and Turkey signed a document at the summit saying that Ukraine's territorial integrity must be respected. But Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they notably did not sign that. So what G7 and the Ukraine summit and BRICS is highlighting is just this kind of like multipolar world we're seeing. And there's just so many different countries involved, and they all have, different opinions on these. Not all, but there are some key differences on the major geopolitical issues of the day.
Yeah, it's smart to bring up the Ukraine summit too, especially because Zelensky kind of made this 11th hour visit to Saudi Arabia on Thursday or Friday of last week, the tail end of last week, when he was trying to meet this number of 100 countries attending the summit. So it's fascinating how much these summits have just played into the role of diplomacy and have really have highlighted different dynamics. So Adam, thank you so much. We really appreciate all your reporting and filling us in.
Thank you.
That's it for today, June 17th. You can read all these stories and more impacting the region at allmonitor.com.